Well, um, this is a chapter on the fundamental principles of material nature. This is from Sankhya section. There is many methods of knowledge, and one is the analytical method, which we analyze things. Now, some of us get knowledge by analysis. Some of us will get knowledge by experience. Some of us will get knowledge by just hearing. Which one of those is best? Now, most devotees will respond, hearing, hearing, hearing. That's not necessarily true. Depends on your particular nature, because we're individuals. So some people get knowledge best by, they really got to analyze things. For those people, we have these chapters here on Sankhya. For those who are very analytical. And it doesn't mean being very analytical is better or worse. I'll give you two examples. There is something called analysis, a paralysis by analysis. Has anybody heard of that expression? Paralysis by analysis, in which you overanalyze something. And when you when you overanalyze, you can actually get paralyzed. So that's paralysis by analysis. Then others will get knowledge by different methods, but some analysis is natural for humans because we got a pretty good brain, for the most part, except for people that tend to run for office. But with that kind of brain, we can analyze to reach an understanding, or we can become paralyzed by it. So Sankhya is a chance to clear this up and help us focus our analytical nature. So that's kind of what's going on. Now, in this particular chapter, Kapila, who's an incarnation, is instructing his mother. He's an incarnation, and his mother, who's brilliant, is asking very good questions. Now, in the Bhagavatam, we're going to talk for a moment about a woman's issue. Sometimes in the Bhagavatam, there is this conception that women are portrayed in a negative way. And in the ninth canto, you get some of that. But when you look at the big picture, sometimes the very smartest people, be it in this chapter with Devahuti, with Kunti, with Draupadi, when it gets into philosophical arguments, they happen to outwit the men and run circles around them. And that happens quite a bit. So I like to point out that the Bhagavatam is an equal opportunity basher. Sometimes it bashes the lower nature of women. Sometimes it bashes the lower nature of men. It's an equal opportunity basher. And for those who are concerned that somebody's not treated well, it ultimately smashes everybody who thinks that they are a man or are a woman. And that bashing is for the purpose of helping free us from over-identifying. So now we'll get to some interesting verses. See what verse we begin on. Beginning on verse 62 to 72. I'm not going to read all these verses. We'll function on 72, the last of the chapter. But when the demigods and presiding deities of the various senses were thus manifested, they wanted to wake the origin of appearances, but failing to do so, they rendered the body, the Vitarupa, they re-entered the body to waken. The Vitarupa is the universal form. So now I'm explaining to you what a Vitarupa is. in a way you'll understand fractal is. I'm going to show you a picture here from nature. This will give you a context of what we're talking about. Yeah, not that one. Yeah, any of the spiral was good. Spiral one. No, not that one. That was not clear. But go back up. I saw one that was good. I'm the one in the center there. That's it. Who here knows what a fractal is? Explain to me what a fractal is.
Geometric pattern is like infinite, and it's like it's within all things, like especially a lot of nature, like flowers, it's a pattern based.
A good example of a fractal is a nautilus shell. And I'll explain what a fractal is. And you may wonder, what does a fractal have to do with a Rata Rupa? And the answer is everything. So we'll explain that. So if you look at that fractal, you see a pattern of a spiral, but a little hard to see. But inside each little segment is another spiral and another spiral and another spiral. And a fractal means it's a mathematical concept in which all these little spirals turn into bigger spirals into the massive spiral. They're all housed within each other. Is that a fair description of a fractal? Anybody else have anything else to say about fractals? Yes.
If you keep zooming in, you're going to keep seeing the same thing. And if you zoom all the way out, it's going to look the same.
Exactly. So that's a fractal. Now we have a fractal. What does a fractal have to do with a Rata Rupa? Anybody guess? Yes.
All of them see the thing.
Yeah, there's even something that's true, a little bit deeper, and that's this. You have inside you, you're alive because you have a spark of spiritual energy. The Virata Rupa, the universal form of the universe, is alive because it has a spark of spiritual energy. Everything that's alive has a spark of spiritual energy. So it's all within. So we're like one of those little mini fractals inside the big fractal. That's the point we're trying to make. And nothing is alive without that spiritual energy. So I'm going to ask a difficult question. And if this question, as we say in the modern days, is a trigger point, no reason to answer it. But I'm going to ask a difficult question. Who here has watched someone die? Okay. When you watch someone die, what was that like?
Very sobering.
Yeah.
Yeah. The demand of the present.
Okay. And what was your experience watching someone die?
It was pretty life-changing. Basically changed, I felt like, my mood for the next couple of years. It's greatly impacted.
Yeah. Shamla?
Yeah, I noticed that it was kind of surreal when the person went from living to dead. Like I noticed a change that happened in the room. The quality of, like something was missing all of a sudden. Her essence was suddenly gone. I could feel that shift. It was very interesting. I've never experienced something like that.
Yeah. I had seen it too many, a lot of times. The most dramatic time for me, not that necessarily the most emotional, the most dramatic time was my dear friend Sundarupa, one of the movement leaders, former GBC, a decade or so ago, was dying. He had some heart issue, was in the hospital and got an infection. But his wife just, Sudharma, wonderful leading lady of the movement just passed on a week ago today. So we're in the hospital surrounded, and the doctors are trying everything. And they run out of things to do. The doctor says, we've run out of things to do. And he's lying there in kind of a comatose state. But what's the last sense to go in the body before you die? Hearing. So we felt he could hear. So we covered him with a Harinam Chatter, with Ganga water in his mouth, tulsi leaf on his forehead, the auspicious things surrounding his bed and chant. But he's hooked up to monitors. And as we're chanting, we're watching the heart monitor go like this, and then it flattens. It was quite a sight to see someone pass on a monitor, because we're in front of him too. And at that moment he dies, you know something dramatically has changed. There's no more animation. Prabhupada likes to give the example. Somebody dies, and a mother goes, my son, where is he? Well, he's not there in that body. Gone. So this is talking about a universal, a bigger body, which also has in it a super soul, a soul that keeps this whole universe alive. The whole point of Sankhya is, if you really start analyzing, and if you really start going deep, you'll realize consciousness is not, this is key, is not an emergent property from the brain. It's not that the brain all of a sudden, one very famous, most famous scientist on consciousness, also kind of a friend of, loves devotees, though doesn't always agree with us, but he's the number one guy. So he gives this lecture. We were together at a conference at IIT in India, and he gave this lecture. And he has this theory that there are quantum states within the microtubulars of the neurons. You don't need to know what a microtubular is. But in the microtubulars, there are quantum states. Now, normally, quantum effects, you can only measure them at very, very low temperatures, like near absolute zero. So normal biological processes are too warm to observe quantum effects, except we know it occurs. What's a quantum effect that occurs in every plant every day? Photosynthesis. It's a quantum effect. It's quantum. Photons come in and they convert it to energy. It's a quantum effect. So quantum things do occur at room temperature. The whole secret of quantum computers is you have to have it an extremely cold state to make it work. So that's part of the problems with it. But we won't digress into quantum computers. So his theory is that there are quantum states, and from these quantum states in the microtubulars, consciousness emanates. And what does the conscious, and I'm not kidding now, this is the PowerPoint he gives. And he says, and here's the quantum state, and here's his proof that there's a quantum state, microtubulars. Then he flashes on the screen, bing, the word bing. And he says, and now we have consciousness. So it's a bing. Are you kidding? It's a bing? And he did that about 10 times. Again, he's a very nice fellow, and he had the biggest conference in the world on conscious April. He had 5 of our devotees giving major talks there.
Bang was already
What? The bang was already taken, so he went with bing. That was it. So Sankhya is basically saying a bing doesn't work. We need to go deeper and understand what is it that animates this dead body? What makes consciousness? So in this particular chapter, we're using, by analogy, the Virata Rupa, the universal form, which also requires some kind of bing. Now, just to digress a little bit on consciousness, one of the great philosophers of, I like very much Notre Dame Hart, who is a non-physicalist. He says conscious cannot be an emergent property from the brain. He gave a talk recently, and he said, I used to be an outlier with a non-physicalist view. Now I've become mainstream. What went wrong? Because the world is shifting now, that consciousness cannot simply be an immanent property of the brain. I was listening to a talk given by Sariputta recently, our late genius among all the Bhaktivedanta Institute, our only super genius we ever had. And the talk was given 1976 at the University of Florida. And Professor Gannon had a radio show. He was a religion professor, a very nice fellow. And the show was called Conversation. He invited Sri Damodar and Sariputta to have a conversation. And so he's asking Sariputta these questions. Sariputta wasn't even initiated then. It was Dr. Thompson. And can consciousness be an emergent property of matter? And it can happen by evolution. Now, he was being a PhD mathematician, then gave the mathematical odds against a primordial soup yielding anything conscious. And they were so ridiculously small. He said, no one with a brain could think it happens that way, so we have to find another explanation. And the professor really liked what he had to say. And of course, that was almost 48 years ago. Since then, we've made a lot of progress, but even in the world of science, in the last 10 years, there's been a major reversal. The number of folks that reject the physics explanation is not a majority, but headed that way, which is quite surprising. So now we'll get to this. Verses. So I'm not going to read all these verses. What they go on is the sun god entered the Vrata Rupa with a sense of sight, and different deities entered the Vrata Rupa in different ways. The god of death entered obviously through the anus, with the organ of defecation. The anus is sometimes associated with death, and sometimes in unfortunate ways. When we leave our body, we like leaving through the top of our head. Can anybody think of a very famous person who left through their bottom instead? Elvis Presley. He was on the toilet straining. He strained too hard and he left his body apparently through the end. Not a very good way to go. Not a very good way to go, though I do admit what a voice Elvis had. God, can that guy sing? They used to call him Elvis the Pelvis. Anyway. Exactly. You put that very well. Well said. Not the most auspicious way, though. So I was talking about various ways of entering the Vrata Rupa. Now we get to the verse at hand. We'll go to 72. And let's go with Sanskrit on there. Shyamala, I'd like you to chant the verse in Sanskrit. Just do it one time. Then they can respond one time.
Tamasmin pratyag atmanam Diya yoga pravrittaya Bhaktya viraktya jnanena Vivichyatmani chintayet.
And could you read the verse in English?
Therefore, through devotion, detachment, and advancement in spiritual knowledge acquired through concentrated devotional service, one should contemplate that supersoul as present in this very body, although simultaneously apart from it.
So in the purport, one can realize a super soul within oneself. Think about that for a moment. How many of you, don't have to answer this, of course, how many of you have a conversation with super soul? It's an interesting challenge. How do you have a conversation with super soul? Hey, anybody down there? Yeah. Um, uh, one time, there was a man at the called the Wailing Wall, the west wall of the old temple in Jerusalem. You've all heard of that famous Western Wall. Jerusalem is the only remnant left of the second temple, Jewish sacred temple. So this man every day was out there praying at this wall. It's a sort of like the Muslims have Mecca. Everybody has, we have a daven. So for the Jews, it's the Western wall. Right? It's praying every day out there for years and years. Somebody was watching. Says, so you're praying here. What's it like praying for all these years? Finally looks up and says, I feel like I'm talking to a wall. So, so sometimes when we try to reach and understand super soul, we can feel like we're talking to a wall. So this is giving us instruction how to rise above that, how to actually have a conversation. I'll tell you a story and then get more here. Go into it a little deeper. When I was young, 10, 15 range, I decided I wanted to understand one thing and one thing only. I watched people die, grandmother, so it's the only we ever saw die in the States. And one schoolmate of mine, sitting in the classroom one day, had a cerebral hemorrhage and died in 1 second. Somebody I knew fairly my age. Very shocking. Someone died. I kept thinking, no one could really ever die. I just intuitively knew I couldn't die. And people are dying. So I wanted the answer to that one question. Spent years thinking, reading. And finally, the Gita later on came across the Gita and I started getting answers. Such a critical question. People are dying, and intuitively we know they can die. I mean, you can't imagine being dead. You can only imagine being asleep. You just can't even imagine being dead. Close your eyes and think I'm dead. It doesn't work. It's not even possible. So we know there's something going on. But how do you know it? Again, this chapter, Sankhya, is giving the analytical way to know it. There are other ways, and can use more than one way. This is the analytical way. So one can realize a super soul within oneself. It's the analytical way. He is within one's body, but apart from the body, to the body. Although sitting in the same body as the individual soul, the super soul has no affection for the body, where the individual soul does. In other words, super soul is not attached to the body. We are, because we're identified with it. One time, I was at gym class. Maybe I was in high school. And we used to call them greasers. They don't have that term, do they? Greasers, they do. He kind of dropped out of high school. And he got a job as an auto mechanic and got one of these souped up cars with the rear end all jacked up real high. And he was thinking, we're all losers while he's the winner. He's living the good life while we're suffering in high school. Then we have gym class at this field. So he brings his souped up car with the rear end all jacked up. And he brings it on the street near the gym class and is doing like zoomies up and down the street. popping the clutch just to show off what the good life likes. And then he popped the clutch at a moment he didn't intend to. The car ran into the curb. And when it ran into the curb, the axle fell off. So here's this car that he spent all his spare time building it, and the axle fell off. He wasn't hurt, not to mention the extreme embarrassment he felt. I still remember the look on his face when he got out of the car, the actual anguish he was feeling. He had so identified with that car that when the axle fell off, he was feeling the same pain as if I had cut his leg off. It's just a car. You can put it back together. Who cares? The same pain, because he had so identified. I didn't know the lesson at that time that applied to me, identified with my body. That lesson came to me years later, but the impression, the agony, still is engraved in my head. And eventually I was able to put two and two together on that. So it's that identification. So super soul doesn't identify with the body. As stated in the first canto of Vasudeva Bhagavati Bhakti Yoga Prayojata, when Vasudeva, the all-pervading Vishnu, the supreme personality of Godhead, is served in complete pure devotion, detachment from the material world begins. The purpose of Sankhya is to detach oneself from material contamination. This can be achieved simply by devotion to the Supreme Person. So even though Sankhya is a totally analytic, its goal is to take us to Bhakti Yoga. There are other ways to get to Bhakti Yoga. But for those who have good analytical brains, it's important. I'll ask a question. Who here is a chess player? I challenge you. Okay, besides that, okay, I like chess. Those who are chess players probably need this chapter. You're very analytical. You think about things. You kind of like analyzing situations. So those who are chess players is a very important chapter for your own devotional life. You might find that true. Just an analytical thing. I need that. I need the analysis. It's just the way my brain happens to be wired. Other people, lucky for them, they don't need all the analysis. Yeah, I'm a servant of God. I'm just going to serve. But for those, our brains get too complicated. What can we do except read this chapter? When one is detached from the attraction of material prosperity, one can actually concentrate his mind upon the super soul. As long as a mind is distracted towards material, there's no possibility of concentrating one's mind, intelligence upon the Supreme Person or his partial representation, super soul. In other words, one cannot concentrate one's mind and energy upon the Supreme unless one is detached from this world. Following detachment, one can actually attain knowledge. As long as one is entangled in sense enjoyment, it is not possible to understand the absolute truth. This is confirmed in the Gita. One who is free from material contamination, according to 1854, is joyful and can enter into devotional service. It is stated that one becomes joyful by discharging devotional service. In that joyful attitude, one can understand the science of God or Krishna consciousness. Otherwise, it is not possible. Now, this is the essence of this chapter. The analytical study of the elements of material nature and the concentration of the mind upon the super soul are the sum and substance of the Sankhya philosophical system. Their perfection culminates in devotional service. So, I want to know if there are any questions, comments, reflections on this somewhat difficult chapter. Yes, Shama.
In regard to what you were talking about, consciousness, there was an article just 5 days ago that came out on the BBC called "Are Animals Conscious? How New Research is Changing Minds." And so there's finally also acceptance and openness to animals being conscious as well as humans, which is, of course, something we know about, but it's nice that science is also starting to back that up, the idea that animals have consciousness.
Yeah, anybody who here has had a pet hamster, dog, cat, monkey. Yeah, monkey, a monkey or dog. Um, um, you know, sometimes I've seen these videos of a monkey becomes very attached to a dog or cat and just hugs it and lies down with it. How to say anybody who's had a pet or worked on a farm that they're not conscious and intelligent and uh, and attached. There's a nice example of attachment. In India, sometimes you want to catch a monkey. There are monkeys who become rascals. If you're in a place like Vrindavan, sometimes the monkeys will steal glasses. Maybe that's happened to anyone. Glasses stolen. Yeah, they steal it. They start chewing on it, and then until you give them a banana, you don't get it back. And I understand them. Banana merchants have trained the monkeys to do that. So it's not surprising. So how do you catch a monkey? Here's how you catch, one way to catch a monkey. Very clever. They want to take the monkey and move it far out of town. You take a coconut and you drill 2 holes in it. One's a small hole, and you attach an anchor inside it and tie it to the tree. So now the coconut's attached, and the other hole is big enough for a monkey's fist to enter. Then inside the coconut, you put a sweet, but a hard sweet, like rock candy, something that you can't squish. Then the monkeys are smart, they'll come. And what will they do? They'll smell it, see it, they'll reach inside to get a piece of candy. And when they do, their hand fits in. And when they do, their hand has to get bigger. They can't pull their hand unless they let go of it. Then the monkey's hand is in it, and they see people coming. They don't want people. They know they're in trouble. So the monkey is trying to get his hand out, but he can't get his hand out because he's so attached to a sweet bowl, he won't let go. And that's how the monkey gets caught. So if any of you ever find a monkey at Krishna House and need to catch it, you know what to do now. So it's that kind of attachment. So that is the metaphor for us. By over-attachment, we have our hand inside. We see a problem coming, and we can't let go of our attachment. So, remember the story of, yes?
Question. I didn't quite get the connection between what you were saying about fractals and the Virata Rupa. Can you just explain again the
Yes.
connection?
Yes. A fractal is a form within a form within a form within a form within a form. And we find, and it can mathematically be described, and in nature and in your body, there are many fractals. And it has a lot to do with how biology works. In fact, when I first came across how important fractals are for biology, I realized, my God, this idea that everything happens by chance is so absurd. It's so brilliant, it's so complicated. And what intermediate form of a fractal would even make sense? Zero. It doesn't do anything. Either you have a whole fractal or you have nothing. So it shows that there is intelligence behind things. But that's not the question you're asking. That was when I first saw fractals. It's one of the 1,000 things I've seen in biology that tells me there's intelligence behind it. And it's like when I look at that picture, I am not very concerned with what pigments the paint is made of. That's what scientists are very look at. What are the pigments of the paint? I'm looking at it and saying, what's the artist telling? So when I look at fractals, I'm saying, what's the artist telling? It's telling me that there's real intelligence behind it. So what a fractal is within something within. In a similar way, we have super soul within us. But within the universe, there's also a super soul animating the whole universe. And within planets, there is super soul. In other words, everything is layers and layers. and there's super soul everywhere. So Virata Rupa is just us on a massive form. And that's why the analogies are given many times in the Bhagavatam, even in the Gita, like the forest or the hairs on the body of it, to try to say that there's super soul at every different level, animating the world. And without that, the world simply stops. So that's the fractal, which is layers within layers.
We could use if we were trying to explain this to a new person, we could use that analogy to help them understand.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Fractals is a good way for somebody who's kind of, what are you talking about here? It's a good metaphor. And when I was reading this chapter this morning in prep, all of a sudden I kept thinking of fractals. So I said, okay, fractals. I had more time, I'd introduce more about the amazing world of fractals, because it really is. And fractals is enough to make an atheist a theist, frankly. Okay, any other questions, comments? Yes, Edward.
Yeah, I remember in the early 90s when there was a theory of chaos that it was emerging, and the world of fractals was unfolding with computer animation and everything. They were able to visualize the mathematical formulas. I remember there was an article how the leading scientists in that theory of chaos, they were admitting a possibility of existence of God.
I'll tell you a story about that. That's an amazing story. It's one that I was amused at. The dear Sadhaputta, Dr. Richard Thompson, wrote an article on this. It's found in the book God and Science. It's one of my favorite articles of his. It's on chaos theory. Who here knows what chaos theory is? Who doesn't know what chaos theory is? Okay, who doesn't know if they know or don't know? So I get everyone involved. Okay, good. I got everyone involved. Okay. Chaos theory was invented by a weather scientist. It's relevant for us in hurricane season. Here's what chaos theory is, and then we'll conclude the story. In chaos, a scientist used massive computers to predict whether a hurricane will hit New Orleans or Jacksonville. You have a little dust devil forming in the African desert. And every once in a while, one of these dust devils makes it offshore, and it hits just the right ocean temperature pressures, and it turns into a whirlwind, turns into a hurricane. And then they start modeling. Now that hurricane season has begun, when the hurricanes are announced, we're all looking at our cell phones. Where's the track going? See, there's all these, the National Oceanographic track, British track, the Canadian model. There have maybe 20 different models. And the models never agree until a day before the hurricane hits. One says it's going here, one says it's going there. So how do these models work? These models take all the data they have and they try to predict where the hurricane will go. Some models might work better than others, but you only know which one works the day after the hurricane hits. So in these models, they run supercomputers. They put in all this wind and other data to predict. Now, in the early days of computers were time-shared. There were no desktop computers. There were mainframe computers. And the mainframe, you only had a certain amount of time you could use it for someone else, because computers at that time could only do one thing at a time. Those are the old mainframe computers. I'm talking about computers in the 70s, 80s. Personal desktop computers started coming out in the early 80s. So these are the mainframes. And in the 70s, scientists studying the mainframe, and you realized, look, I'm calculating out these weather patterns to 20 decimal places, but I can only measure to 5 decimal places. So therefore, what I'm going to do is I'm only going to have the computer work to 5 decimal places, because I can't even measure out to 20 decimal places. This will save me time on the computer. because I'm time sharing. I only have so much time. I can run more models. So he cut off these decimal places that are impossible to measure. It's beyond what our ability to measure. And when he did it, the prediction for the hurricane changed from hitting Miami to New Orleans. And he realized, wait, these are numbers that I can't even measure. They're beyond what we can measure. And that can determine if a hurricane can go here or there. Sariputta put that together, and he realized, wait, and he wrote a lecture called God and the Laws of Physics. He wasn't proving anything. He was making this point, that could God control everything and still the laws of physics work? He says, yes, because it's beyond what we can measure. And we know that Krishna glances, and by his glance, the material nature can be animated and moved. So he said, theoretically, he's not proving a point. It's just making an hypothesis that God can actually control things because he can work in that realm beyond where we can measure. But that realm can have huge impacts, like with the hurricane hit Miami or Gainesville. And it's a snowball effect. You take a little tiny snowball and you roll it down the hill. And by the time it gets to the bottom of the long hill, it's a giant snowball the size of this room. So that's what happens. This little death devil starts off. By the time it hits us, it's 160 miles an hour of wind, creating chaos. The butterfly effect, too. Yeah, it's called the butterfly effect. That's right, I forgot that. And the butterfly effect means that if a butterfly flew by this dust devil, theoretically, in the African desert, that little wind from the butterfly's wings would have enough effect on that dust devil that one butterfly, by the snowball effect, could determine if that hurricane is hitting Texas or Florida. Now, no one can measure that effect. It's way beyond what any instrument is ever going to be able to measure. So Sariputta made this point that God can still control everything and the laws of physics can still work using model of chaos theory. So I was at the College of Worcester in the 80s, and I invited Sariputta to come speak. They gave an honorarium and a ticket. And it was an unusual college, College of Worcester, which the initials stand for cow, as the only college in America that actually offered undergraduate free rides to students from India. They had an endowment to do that. So it was an unusual place. And we had a little campus Krishna house, you might say, there in the 80s. And the religion department was a special religion department. One professor there, Christian Indian, Ishwara Harris, had taken his students to India for a semester abroad. And 3 days of it was spending at the Krishna Balaram temple. And while they were at the Krishna Balaram temple, the Prime Minister of India, Indira Gandhi, was assassinated by her own guards. They riddled her with machine gun bullets in her garden, as her own personal guards. And they were mad at her for something. I guess they're pretty mad at her. And so at that time, then there were huge riots and no one could travel. So this whole class got stuck at the Krishna Balaram temple for over a month. And then I showed up on campus just when they got back. Interesting times. And so I became very friendly with the religion department. And then they invited Sariputta to come. Now, the chairman of the religion department is typical of chairman of religion departments. What's one quality you find in the chairman of religion departments almost universally at schools other than Christian schools? What? They're atheists. They're all atheists. We just left them, not all, just almost all. So he was a good atheist, chairman of religion. It's so funny how often that happens, but it is like that. I can explain why another time. So he began the seminar. He said, Dr. Thompson, you're so glad you came here, and Honor to have you speak. And then he goes, and remember, when the lecture's over, none of the faculty can ask questions. Only students can ask questions until they're done. Then us faculty, we can ask questions. So Sariputta gave this lecture on chaos theory and how the laws of physics and God are completely compatible. Not proof, but showing they are compatible. When he was done with the lecture, the professor basically, the hell with his rules, and he started rapid shooting questions at Sariputta. What about this? What about that? He couldn't believe that God can exist. He was so offended by the lecture. He violated every rule, kept shooting questions. And Sariputta knocked every one of them down. It was a brilliant, wonderful moment in which chaos theory and the butterfly effect won the day. And the students were quite happy with that. The professor was quite defeated, but like most professors, wouldn't admit it. So with that, it is prasadam time. We'll stop here. Thank you very much. I hope you have a wonderful day thinking of Krishna. And those of you who are analytical, dig into this chapter. You'll love it. And those of you who aren't analytical, don't worry about that. That's fine too. Hare Krishna.
The deity of Sri Govinda, the spirit of Godhead, the transcendental Krishna Nam and Bhagavad Mahaprabhu ki.
Jai.